"Who did this to you?" Mom asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Who killed you, Jane?" The figure's eyes flickered with something, anger, pain, or perhaps something else. And then, without warning, it took a step forward. "Mom," I shouted, reaching out to grab her arm, but it was too late. The figure moved faster than I could react, and in the blink of an eye, it was standing directly in front of her, its cold presence overwhelming. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The figure wasn't just standing there. It was now looking directly at my mother, its expression filled with something unreadable. Mom didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes meeting Jane's, as if she were daring the spirit to confront her fully. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was like a standoff between the living and the dead. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving nothing but the lingering chill of its presence. Did we do it?" I asked quietly, still in shock. Mom turned to face me, her expression conflicted. "I don't know, but I think Jane has finally been heard." The air around us seemed to shift, and the heavy weight that had been pressing on the field started to lift. The atmosphere was no longer suffocating, but instead there was a strange sense of calm, as if the unresolved anger that had held Jane in this world had finally been acknowledged. "I don't think she's coming back," Mom said softly. "Not now." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning. There were still so many questions left unanswered. About Jane, about her death, and about what had brought her back to haunt us in the first place. But for now, we had done what we came here to do. We had listened, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to set her spirit free. As we left the field behind, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The moonlight shone brightly, illuminating the place where Jane's life had ended. It was a place of darkness, but now there was also a sense of closure. The past had been confronted, and the ghosts had been laid to rest. But I knew that no matter where we went from here, Jane's story would never be forgotten. I looked at the photo of Jane Bellamy, her sad eyes staring into the camera, and felt a strange weight settle in my chest. "Is this the girl, Mom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the page, her face pale as she scanned the text. I could tell she was struggling with something, trying to piece together the details that had haunted her for so long. "I think this is it," she whispered finally. "But something isn't right. Why would she come back? Why now?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of our investigation pressing on my shoulders. "What do we do now?" Mom closed the book with a snap and looked at me, her expression grim. "We go to the place where she died. We need to know what happened to her. We need to find out who killed her." The night air was thick with tension as we made our way toward the place where Jane Bellamy had died, an old, overgrown field at the edge of town. The moonlight cast long shadows across the ground, and every rustle of leaves made my heart race. The stillness of the area was unsettling, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. "This is it," Mom whispered, her voice tight with fear and determination. She looked around, as if expecting Jane, or whatever spirit still lingered, to appear at any moment. "We need to find out the truth." We had spent the last few hours gathering every bit of information we could from the library, and though we learned a lot, none of it gave us the answers we needed. There were no clues about the identity of Jane's killer, and no one had ever been charged with her death. It was a cold case, one that had haunted the town for decades. But now, standing in the place where she had died, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the verge of uncovering something far darker than we had imagined. Whatever had happened to Jane Bellamy was still unfinished, still unresolved, and we were about to confront the consequences of that. I shivered as we stepped into the overgrown field, the long grass brushing against our legs. The air felt thick with the past, as though the weight of Jane's tragic death had never fully lifted from this place. "Stay close," Mom said, her voice strained. We don't know what we're dealing with here. I nodded, but deep down, I felt a surge of anxiety. Every step I took felt like it was pulling me further into a nightmare I didn't fully understand. The further we ventured into the field, the more I could feel an inexplicable chill in the air, like the presence of something, or someone, was just beyond our sight, watching us. We reached a small clearing, and there, in the middle of the field, was a weathered wooden sign. It was faded and nearly unreadable, but the words were still visible. Memorial for Jane Bellamy, murdered December 1976. Mom stopped in front of it, her hand shaking as she reached out to touch the sign. "This is where it happened," she said quietly. "This is where Jane died." I felt my stomach churn. The idea that we were standing in the same spot where her life had been violently ended was almost too much to bear. I could feel the weight of her spirit pressing in, as though Jane was watching us, waiting for us to uncover the truth. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just the empty darkness of the field. I was about to speak when Mom grabbed my arm, her grip tight and urgent. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze, and for a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then, I saw it too. A figure, just at the edge of the clearing, standing motionless. The figure was wearing a long, flowing dress, just like the girl my mother and uncle had described all those years ago. "Jane," I breathed, the word coming out as a whisper. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, staring at us with an eerie stillness. Mom's eyes were wide with recognition. "It's her," she said, her voice trembling. "She's come back." But this time, the figure didn't feel like a friendly spirit or a curious presence. There was something cold, something angry in the way she stood there, watching us. The silence was deafening. The wind had died down, and the night seemed to hold its breath. I felt like we were being drawn into something that wasn't just about Jane anymore. It was about everything that had happened in this town, everything that had been buried for so long. "I know what you want," Mom said suddenly, her voice calm but resolute. She stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Jane's ghostly figure. "You want justice. You want to be remembered." The figure didn't move, but I could feel the tension in the air shift. It was as though Jane was listening, waiting for something. The light from the room flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. For a long moment, the house was eerily silent. I looked at Mom, who was still staring at the spot where the figure had vanished, as though she was waiting for something, waiting for the moment to pass, or perhaps for something worse to return. "Mom, what just happened?" I asked again, my voice weak, trembling in the quiet air. She didn't answer me immediately. She was still processing what had occurred, her eyes glued to the empty space where Jack had been, where the ghostly figure had stood only moments ago. "What's going on, Mom?" I pressed, fear creeping into my voice. "Who was she?" Finally, she turned to me, her face pale, lips drawn tight. She didn't look like herself, not entirely. She looked like a woman on the edge of something far darker than what we'd been prepared for. That was her," Mom whispered, her voice shaking. "The girl from the stories. The one your uncle and I saw." "But how?" I asked, confused and frightened. "You said she died, didn't she?" "That she was." "Yes," Mom interrupted, "she died. But she never left." We stood in silence for a long moment, each of us grappling with the reality of the situation. The ghostly figure, the girl from the past, had been here, in our house, and she had come for Jack. But why? And what did she want? Mom turned to face Jack's unconscious form. He was still lying on the floor, his body limp, his breathing shallow. His face was twisted in terror, his eyes squeezed shut, as if trying to block out some horrible vision. "What's happening to him?" I asked, my voice tight. "I don't know," Mom said softly, kneeling beside him. She reached out to touch his forehead, and her hand recoiled slightly. "It's cold, colder than it should be. I took a step forward, but Mom held up her hand, stopping me. "Don't get too close," she warned. "Something's not right." We both looked at Jack, but neither of us dared to move closer. I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on us, as if the very air was heavy with the ghost's presence. There was an overwhelming sense that we were not alone, and that whatever Jack had done, or whatever had been done to him, was far from over. I think we need to leave," I said, my voice shaky. "This place, it's not safe anymore." Mom hesitated, her gaze locked on Jack. "I wish it were that simple." "Then what do we do?" I asked desperately. "We can't just sit here while something like that is haunting us. We need to figure out what's going on." Mom stood up, her face hardening with resolve. "I know. We're going to find out what happened to her, to the girl. We're going to get to the bottom of this." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked, unsure. She doesn't seem like she's here to help us." Mom turned to me, her eyes narrowing with determination. "I don't care. We can't keep running from this. We need to face it head on, or it's just going to keep coming after us." Her words rang in my ears, and I nodded, though part of me felt like we were walking straight into something far worse than we could imagine. Still, I trusted her. I had to. "We need to go to the library," Mom said suddenly. "There might be something there. Some information we can use to figure out what happened to her." I didn't ask any questions. We gathered our things, and with Jack still lying motionless on the floor, we made our way out of the house, trying to act as if nothing was wrong, even though everything was wrong. The drive to the library felt longer than it should have. The weight of the situation hung over us like a dark cloud. Every time I looked at Mom, I could see the doubt creeping into her expression, though she tried to hide it. Whatever was going on, whatever had brought the ghost back into our lives, was far beyond anything we had anticipated. As we walked into the library, the musty smell of old books greeted us, and the quiet buzz of whispers from the other patrons did little to calm my nerves. I followed Mom as she led me to the far corner of the building, where a section of local history books sat on dusty shelves. "This is it," Mom murmured, pulling a thick book from the shelf. "The history of our town. Everything you need to know." She opened the book to the section on unsolved mysteries, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw the page. There, in faded black and white print, was the name of the girl who had haunted our family for decades. Her photograph stared back at me, her face frozen in time, just as my mom and uncle had described it. The caption beneath the picture sent chills down my spine. "Jane Bellamy, missing since December 1976. Body found days later, stabbed multiple times. No suspects ever identified." "No," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "She's not supposed to be here." Mom reached out for him, but Jack stepped back, his movements jerky and frantic. "What do you mean?" she asked. "What are you talking about?" I didn't want it to happen. I didn't want to." Jack's voice broke off into a scream, and he dropped to his knees. For a moment, I thought he might collapse, but instead, his whole body trembled as if something was forcing him to relive a moment from the past. "Mom," I cried, stepping forward. "What's happening?" But Mom didn't answer me. She was too focused on Jack, her expression filled with a mix of fear and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Jack, please," she said gently, kneeling down beside him. "You have to tell me. What happened to that girl?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it made my chest tighten. "She's here because of me," he whispered. "She's here because of what I did." I couldn't breathe. My thoughts were swirling, my heart racing in my chest. What was Jack saying? What had he done? And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind us. "Mom, we're not alone," I whispered. But she didn't hear me. She was too absorbed in Jack's strange, broken ramblings. "She came for me," Jack said again, his voice a strained whisper. "And now she's going to take me back. She won't let me leave until I pay for what I did." "What did you do?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. But Jack didn't answer. Instead, he looked up, his eyes wide with terror, as if he was seeing something none of us could see. And then I saw it too. A figure standing in the doorway, just beyond the shadows. It was faint, but I could make out a shape. A woman, dressed in something old and tattered, her hair wild and untamed. Her eyes were fixed on Jack, her face twisted in anger. Mom turned slowly, her face paling as she saw the figure too. "No," she whispered, taking a step back. "It's her. It's really her." The woman stepped forward, her footsteps slow but deliberate. Jack was trembling now, his entire body shaking as if the very sight of her had drained the life from him. "No, please," Jack cried, scrambling backward on the floor. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." But the woman didn't stop. She walked toward him, her expression cold and unforgiving. "She's come for me," Jack whispered, as if he was already resigned to his fate. The woman reached out, her hand hovering over his head. "Jack," Mom whispered, her voice full of sorrow. "She's not here to forgive you." And just as the woman's hand descended, a bright light filled the room, blinding me for a moment. When I blinked, the figure was gone, and Jack was on the floor, unconscious. I looked at Mom, my heart pounding in my chest. "What just happened?" I asked. But all she could do was stare at the spot where the woman had been. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think we're in deeper than we ever imagined." Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from below, soft but unmistakable. "Someone's here," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "Get down," Mom whispered urgently, pulling me behind a large, dusty armchair. We crouched low, our breathing shallow as we waited. The footsteps came closer, echoing up the stairs, until they stopped right outside the room. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was wouldn't find us. The door creaked open, and a shadow filled the doorway. I couldn't make out the figure, but I could hear the faint sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. A moment passed, and then the shadow stepped into the room, standing still for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the figure moved again, walking slowly toward the record player. The humming continued, filling the room like a living thing. The figure reached out, placed a hand on the turntable, and stopped the record. "Who's there?" Mom demanded, her voice steady but loud enough to break the silence. The figure froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our collective breath. But then the figure slowly turned to face us. It was Jack Turner. The room seemed to freeze as Jack Turner, or someone who looked exactly like him, stepped forward. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and distant, and his clothes, old as if they hadn't been touched in decades, hung loosely on his thin frame. He didn't look alive, not in the way people should. It was as if he had walked out of a memory, or worse, a nightmare. "Mom, is that him?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. Mom didn't answer at first. She just stared at the figure, her eyes wide, her face pale. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the uncertainty in her stance. "Jack?" she finally asked, her voice a whisper. "Jack Turner." The figure didn't speak at first. It just stood there, staring at us with those hollow eyes, as if he didn't recognize us, or perhaps as if he didn't care. "Mom, I don't think he's real," I said, my voice shaking. I took a step back, my hand reaching for hers. But Mom didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer to the figure, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "You were supposed to be dead," she whispered. The figure, Jack Turner, if that's who he really was, took a slow, deliberate step toward her. For a moment, I thought he was going to speak, but he didn't. His movements were unnaturally stiff, as if he had no life left in him, just the semblance of one. "I'm not dead," he said finally, his voice low, raspy, like something dragged from deep beneath the earth. I froze. Then what are you? I asked, my voice small in the face of this thing that seemed to not quite belong in this world. Jack turned his gaze to me, his eyes empty yet full of something that I couldn't explain. His mouth twisted into something like a smile, but it wasn't kind. It was dark. I'm the one who never left, he said, his voice echoing in the room. I've been waiting for you to come. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back, bumping into the old chair. You've been waiting? Mom asked, her voice trembling. For what? Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to face the record player, still silent in the corner. The humming had stopped now, but the atmosphere in the room felt charged, like the air itself was waiting for something. The girl, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She came to me. When they. His words faltered, his face twisting as if he was struggling to remember something or trying to block it out. Mom stepped forward, her gaze locked on him. Who came to you? I was the last one to see her, Jack said, his voice barely audible. The last one to. Suddenly, he stopped, his whole body stiffening. His eyes grew wide with terror, as if he had seen something we couldn't. We stood outside Jack Turner's old house, the air heavy with the secrets it held. The woods behind it whispered like an ancient story, and the smell of decay hung in the air. For a brief moment, it felt as if the whole world had gone silent, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting. And then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible hum. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the branches of the trees. But as I stood still, straining to listen, the humming grew louder, a soft, eerie vibration that seemed to be coming from the house itself. Do you hear that? I whispered to Mom. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she cocked her head to the side, as if trying to decipher the sound. Her face tightened, and I saw her hand reach for her phone. Stay here, she said. I'm going to check the back of the house. I watched her walk toward the side yard, her steps careful but quick. The humming was growing louder now, as if it was calling us, coaxing us to go closer. I followed her silently, not sure if I was drawn in by the noise or by my own curiosity. The closer we got to the back of the house, the more the humming seemed to surround us, until it was all I could hear. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like a presence, like someone was waiting for us. When we reached the back door, we found it ajar, the wood creaking in the wind. My heart skipped a beat, but Mom pushed forward. She had a determined look on her face, one I knew meant she wasn't going to back down from this. Stay close, she whispered. I nodded, and we stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind us with a soft thud. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. It was like time had forgotten this place, leaving it suspended in a long frozen moment. And then I heard it again, the hum. It was louder now, more distinct, almost like a chant. It was coming from upstairs. Mom and I exchanged a glance, both of us silently agreeing to move forward. The stairs creaked under our weight as we slowly ascended, the humming growing louder with every step we took. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, the air growing colder, heavier. It was like we were walking deeper into a dream, a place where reality didn't make sense. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before us, dimly lit by the flickering light from a broken window. The door at the end of the hall was slightly cracked, and I could see shadows moving inside, as if someone, or something, was there. Should we go in? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom didn't answer immediately. She just looked at me, her eyes full of the same uncertainty I felt. We need to find out what's going on here, she said quietly. With that, she reached for the door handle and slowly pushed the door open. The sound of the creaking door echoed in the silent house, sending a chill through me. Inside, the room was covered in dust, but what caught my attention immediately was the old record player in the corner, the one that had to be at least 50 years old. Its needle was moving across a record, playing the soft, eerie hum we had heard before. But there was no one in the room. "Who's playing this?" I asked, stepping closer to the record player. Mom frowned. "It's not playing by itself. Someone set this up." The needle scratched across the vinyl, and the sound distorted for a moment before returning to its steady, haunting hum. It was then that I noticed something else, a small piece of paper on the floor beside the player. I bent down to pick it up, my heart racing as I unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten in a neat but hurried script. "If you're reading this, you've come too far. Stop now before it's too late." My breath caught in my throat as I handed the letter to Mom. We stared at it, both of us unsure of what to make of it. It didn't seem like a warning from the past. It felt like someone had left it for us, someone who wanted us to stop searching. "That's not from Leila," Mom said, shaking her head. "This is someone else." I couldn't help but shiver at the thought. Who would leave this letter here, and why? Mom and I spent the next few days trying to piece together what had happened to Leila. She went through every newspaper article, every missing persons report, and even old letters to see if there were any signs of foul play. Anything that could point us in the right direction. It was during one of those late-night research sessions that Mom found something. A name. Jack Turner. Jack Turner had been a prominent figure in the town in the 70s. He was a businessman, respected by many, but known for his temper and his tendency to avoid attention. He had always stayed out of the public eye, but when Mom started digging into his past, she discovered something unsettling. Jack Turner had been one of the last people to see Leila alive. The more we learned about Jack Turner, the more my stomach churned. It turned out that he had been living just a few miles outside of town, in a large, isolated house near the woods. He was married, had kids, and ran a local business. But there were whispers about affairs, about power, and about his connections to certain people in town that gave him a lot of leeway. Mom went to see Jack Turner's old business records, but what she found only made things worse. There were no signs of criminal activity, but she did find something strange, an insurance policy, one that Jack had taken out on his business just days before Leila's disappearance. The policy was large enough to suggest that Jack stood to gain a significant amount of money if something happened to him or his company. "That's suspicious," Mom said, tapping the paper with her finger. "It's like he knew something was coming." But the connection to Leila still didn't make sense. Why would he have had anything to do with her death? The answer came unexpectedly. Mom's search led her to one more lead. A letter. It had been tucked away in the back of a file at the old post office. The letter was postmarked December 1976, the same month that Leila had disappeared. It was addressed to Jack Turner. When Mom opened it, she gasped. The letter was from Leila. "I know what you did, Jack. You can't hide from me. I'll tell everyone. I'll make sure the truth comes out." The letter was brief, but enough to send a chill down my spine. Leila had known. She had figured out what Jack was involved in, and she had planned to expose him. I couldn't shake the thought that Leila had been trying to fight back, trying to stop something terrible from happening. Maybe that was why she had been killed. Maybe Jack had been afraid of what would come out. Mom and I shared an uneasy silence. We had no proof, only these disturbing pieces that didn't fit together yet. But the letter was a start. The next day, we went to visit Jack Turner's old house. It stood at the edge of the woods, looming like a silent sentinel to the past. The house had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, its gates rusted. As we stood in front of the house, something strange happened. We heard it. Again. The humming. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and pointed toward the woods. I woke up with a start, my heart racing. The dream felt so real, like Leila was trying to show me something. The next morning, I told Mom about the dream. She listened intently, her expression unreadable. "She wants us to go to the woods," Mom said finally. "Are you serious?" Dad asked, his tone incredulous. "You're basing this on a dream." "It's not just a dream," Mom replied. "It's a sign. She's guiding us." Reluctantly, Dad agreed to go. We packed flashlights, a map, and some snacks, and set out for the woods where the abandoned Cadillac had been found all those years ago. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears strain for any sound. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a clearing. At the center of the clearing was a small, overgrown mound of earth. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom knelt down, brushing away the leaves and dirt. She froze, her eyes widening in shock. It was a headstone. The inscription was barely legible, worn away by decades of weather, but one word was clear: Lila. We stared at the grave in stunned silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. "She's been here all along," Mom said, tears streaming down her face. "Now what?" Dad asked, his voice shaky. "We call the police," Mom replied, "and we give her the justice she deserves." The grave marked the turning point. It was no longer just a mystery, no longer something spooky and unexplainable. We had stumbled upon something much more real, something that had been buried, hidden for years. Mom didn't wait a second longer. She pulled out her phone and dialed the police, her hands trembling as she spoke. "We found a grave," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "It's an old case, a missing girl from 1976. I think we found where she's been all this time." The officer on the other end didn't seem to understand at first, but when Mom mentioned the name Lila Montgomery, he went silent for a moment. "Stay where you are," the officer finally said. "We'll send someone to you." It didn't take long for the authorities to arrive. A few officers walked cautiously into the clearing, their flashlights flickering in the dark, and when they saw the grave, they froze, their faces going pale. Who found this?" one of the officers asked, looking up at us. "We did," Dad replied. "We've been looking into Layla's disappearance. She was never properly investigated. We thought this might be the place she ended up." The officer didn't say anything at first. He just crouched down, inspecting the grave. His expression grew more serious with every second that passed. "I remember this case," the officer said after a long pause. "It was a cold case, long forgotten. But we never found her body. Just the car. No leads, no suspects. People moved on. It's been over 40 years. I thought the case had gone cold for good." "Someone buried her here," Mom said, voice trembling. "Someone knew what happened to her." The days that followed were a blur of police investigations, news stories, and questions that led to more questions. The authorities exhumed the body, and forensic teams were brought in. It was then that the horrifying details of Lila's final moments began to surface. The autopsy confirmed what we had feared. Lila had been brutally murdered, multiple stab wounds to her chest, her face showing signs of trauma as if she had fought back. The manner in which she had been buried, so hastily, as if someone had been trying to hide the truth, sent chills down my spine. But what disturbed me the most was the revelation about her last hours. The medical examiner found traces of alcohol in her system, indicating that she had been drugged before being killed. The coroner also discovered an unusual detail: a piece of fabric from a jacket found near her body. It didn't match anything she was wearing. And then there was the strangest thing of all. Lila's body had been found facing toward the woods, her arms stretched out as if she had been trying to reach someone, before the life was drained from her. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. It didn't make sense. Who would do this to her, and why? The strange occurrences around our house didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow more frequent. Footsteps in the driveway, shadows moving just out of sight, and the faint sound of humming late at night, like someone was singing a tune from far away. I started to feel like Lila was watching us, trying to guide us towards something we couldn't see yet. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the humming. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I got up, my heart pounding, and peeked out the window. There she was. Leela stood by the mailbox, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She wasn't looking at me, but somehow I knew she knew I was there. Her lips moved silently, as if she were trying to say something, but no sound came out. I wanted to scream for Mom, but something stopped me. Instead, I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture. When I looked at the screen, the photo showed nothing but an empty yard. The next morning, I showed the photo to Mom. She stared at it for a long time before finally speaking. "She's trying to tell us something," Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what?" I asked. Mom didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her coat and headed out the door, leaving me and Dad to exchange confused glances. "She's going to the diner," Dad said after a moment. "Why?" "Because that's where Leela was last seen." The diner was one of those old-fashioned places that seemed frozen in time. It hadn't changed much since the 70s. Red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a faint smell of grease lingering in the air. Mom spoke to the manager, an older woman who'd worked there for over 30 years. At first, the woman didn't remember Leela, but as Mom showed her the missing persons report, something clicked. "Oh, that's right," the woman said, her brow furrowing. "She used to work here, didn't she? Sweet girl. Quiet. Always kept to herself. Do you remember anything unusual about her disappearance?" Mom asked. The woman hesitated, glancing around as if checking to see who might be listening. "I don't like to gossip," she said, lowering her voice, "but I do remember there was some talk about a man she was seeing. Older guy. Real secretive. Do you know his name?" The woman shook her head. "No, but I remember he drove one of those big cars, Cadillacs, I think. Used to park right out front and wait for her after her shift." Mom thanked her and left, her mind racing with new possibilities. That night, Mom shared what she'd learned with us. She was seeing someone, Mom said, her voice trembling with excitement. An older man with a Cadillac. "What if he's the one, whoa?" "Stop," Dad interrupted. "Don't go jumping to conclusions. You're talking about something that happened 50 years ago. We don't even know if this man had anything to do with her disappearance." "But it's a lead," Mom insisted, "and it's more than we had before." The next day, Mom dug deeper, searching for any mention of a man driving a Cadillac in the old records. It was slow, grueling work, but eventually she found something. A police report from 1977. The report detailed an abandoned Cadillac found near a wooded area outside of town. The car had been stripped for parts, but the police noted that the trunk smelled strongly of bleach. Why would someone bleach the trunk of a car? I asked as Mom read the report aloud. Dad sighed. "You know why." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implication sank in. That night, I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was standing by the mailbox, the cool night air chilling my skin. Lila was there, her hair falling over her face as she stared at something in the distance. But I knew it wasn't just her imagination. I'd seen the girl too. As the weeks passed, I started to notice little things that didn't seem right. Late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window, soft and deliberate, as if someone were walking up and down the driveway. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move past the mailbox, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. Then there was the night my uncle came home in a panic. He'd been staying with us on and off, and I'd gotten used to his late-night arrivals. But this time was different. I heard the sound of his car backing into the yard, the headlights illuminating the trees as he slammed on the brakes. He jumped out of the car, muttering under his breath, and shone a flashlight toward the neighbor's yard. "What are you doing?" Dad asked, stepping outside to confront him. "She was there," my uncle said, his voice tight. "By the pines. She was just standing there, staring. Dad shook his head, dismissing it as nonsense, but I knew my uncle wasn't the type to scare easily. If he'd seen the girl, then there had to be something to it. The stories about the girl by the mailbox became more frequent, each one eerier than the last. Mom started refusing to drive at night, and my uncle wouldn't leave the house without a flashlight. One evening, as we sat around the kitchen table, Mom spoke up. "I think she's trying to tell us something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell us what?" Dad asked, his skepticism evident. "I don't know," Mom admitted, "but she keeps appearing in the same spot, doing the same thing. It's like she's waiting for someone, or something." I couldn't shake the feeling that Mom was right. There was something about the girl that felt unfinished, like she was stuck, trapped in a loop, unable to move on. The final straw came one cold December night. We were decorating the Christmas tree when the phone rang. Mom answered, and I watched as her face turned pale. "What's wrong?" Dad asked, his concern growing. "They found a body," Mom said, her voice trembling. "An unclaimed body, heavily decomposed, just outside of town." My stomach dropped. I didn't know why, but I had a feeling, an unshakable certainty, that the body was connected to the girl. "Do you think?" I started to ask, but Mom cut me off. "I don't know," she said, her voice firm. "But I'm going to find out." The next day, Mom started digging through old newspaper archives, searching for any mention of the girl. It was slow, painstaking work, but eventually, she found something. A missing persons report from December 1976. The girl in the photo was identical to the one by the mailbox. "That's her," Mom said, her voice filled with both fear and determination. "That's the girl." As I stared at the photo, a chill ran down my spine. The girl wasn't just a ghost. She was someone real, someone who had lived and died in our town. And for some reason, she was still here. Secrets of the past. The discovery of the missing persons report turned our family's curiosity into something far more serious. We weren't just dealing with a ghost story anymore. We were looking at a tragedy that had been buried for decades. Her name was Leila Montgomery. She was 19 years old, last seen walking home from her part-time job at a diner just outside of town. The police report was sparse, filled with the kind of vague details that made it clear no one had looked too hard for her. "Likely ran away," one officer had written in the margins, as if her disappearance was just another rebellious teenager's story. But Leila hadn't run away. That much was obvious. Mom became obsessed with learning everything she could about Leila. She combed through old newspapers, talked to neighbors who'd lived in town for years, and even went to the library to pull up old property records. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed like everyone had simply forgotten about her. "It's like she just vanished," Mom said one evening, spreading out her findings across the kitchen table. "No follow-up, no search parties, nothing." Dad frowned, flipping through one of the yellowed newspaper clippings. "What are you hoping to find?" he asked. "This was almost 50 years ago. Whoever was responsible is probably long gone." "I'm not looking for someone to blame," Mom replied, her voice firm. "I'm looking for answers. She deserves that much." It started as nothing more than a whisper of the story, one that only surfaced late at night when the house was quiet and everyone was on edge. The girl by the mailbox. She wasn't someone you'd ever expect to hear about in a small, quiet town like ours. My mother would tell the tale sparingly, only when prompted, and even then, she'd get this faraway look in her eyes, as if recalling something she wasn't sure she believed herself. "She was there," Mom would always say, her voice low, almost trembling, "right by the mailbox. She never moved, never looked at me, but I knew she was there, always at night, always wearing the same thing, a skirt and blouse like she'd stepped straight out of the 70s. I was just a kid the first time I heard the story, too young to grasp how strange it truly was. To me, It sounded like one of those spooky ghost tales adults told to keep kids entertained or, more often, to scare us into behaving. But as I grew older, I realized Mom's story wasn't meant to entertain. It was something she genuinely believed, or feared. The girl, according to her, always appeared in the same spot, right where our mailbox stood at the edge of the yard. She never acknowledged the car, never waved, never even seemed to notice anyone was watching her. She just stood there, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she were cold, her hair falling over her face until she pushed it behind her ear. She looked like she was waiting for someone, Mom would say, her brow furrowed. But as soon as the headlights hit her, she was gone. Every time. What made it even stranger was that Mom wasn't the only one who claimed to have seen her. My uncle, her brother, shared similar stories, though he wasn't as forthcoming. He'd come home late from work, his face pale, his hand shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. When pressed, he'd mutter something about the girl and leave it at that. "She's not hurting anyone," he once said, his voice barely audible. "Just don't mess with her. Leave her be." I didn't know what to make of their stories. They were too consistent to be dismissed as mere imagination, but the idea of a ghostly girl haunting our mailbox felt too far-fetched. Still, the stories persisted, becoming a strange sort of family legend. Years passed, and I stopped thinking about the girl, until one night when everything changed. It was late, probably close to midnight. My parents and I were driving home from a friend's house, the kind of long, quiet drive where the only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I was half asleep in the backseat when I felt the car lurch to a sudden stop. "Stop! Stop the car!" Mom's voice was sharp, almost panicked. Dad slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart raced as I sat up, looking around in confusion. "What is it?" Dad asked, his tone irritated. "Why are we stopping?" "She's there," Mom whispered, her eyes fixed on the mailbox ahead. "The girl. She's standing right there." I followed her gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the faint outline of the mailbox against the trees. But then, as the headlights swept across the road, I saw her. She was exactly as Mom had described. A young girl, maybe 19 or 20, dressed in a skirt and blouse that seemed out of place for the time. Her hair fell over her face, and she pushed it back behind her ear with a delicate motion. She didn't look at us, didn't move, didn't react in any way. And then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone. "What the?" Dad muttered, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "She's real," Mom said, her voice trembling. "I told you she was real." Dad shook his head, muttering something about tricks of the light, but I couldn't shake the image of the girl. She hadn't looked like a trick of the light. She'd looked real. The next day, Mom couldn't stop talking about the encounter. She called my uncle, who listened in silence before finally saying, "I told you. Leave her be." But Mom couldn't leave it be. She started researching local legends and ghost stories, trying to find any mention of a girl fitting the description. She found nothing. "It's like she doesn't exist," Mom said one evening, frustration evident in her voice. "Maybe she doesn't," Dad replied, clearly tired of the topic. "Maybe it's just your imagination."